Hello everybody and welcome to this Oliver Wight webinar on data accuracy in the healthcare industry. With you today we have myself, Gary Connors, and sitting with me virtually is another Oliver Wight partner, Steve Rowntree. We'll introduce ourselves in a little while. So if we click through to the next slide, that's who you're talking to virtually. So there's myself, Gary Connors, and another Oliver Wight partner, Steve Rowntree. Steve, do you want to tell us about yourself in a few minutes?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the webinar, and thanks for connecting today. Just a bit of background of myself. So I've been with Oliver Wight for over 14 years now, with a background in pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and within the chemical industry. So that's kind of sectors I worked in before joining Oliver Wight. Working across Oliver Wight now, obviously we work with multiple sectors, currently working in biotech, pharma, and medical diagnostic with different clients. And really today it's one of those subjects that I think is fundamental for lots of businesses to get right. So often this gets ignored, or it's seen as important but not urgent. So it is an area that I'm passionate about in businesses, and I know that data and passion don't often go in the same sentence, but they probably should. So I'm looking forward to today's webinar with you.
Thanks, Steve. And like Steve, I have a background in industry, also in the chemical and pharmaceutical industries. Steve and I worked together about 20 years ago while we were both holding roles in Abbott. I'd subsequently held roles in GSK and in Novartis. And if I can say this, my most recent real job before becoming a consultant was managing director of Novartis UK chemical operations. So throughout that history of my career, I've been intrigued by the lack of excitement behind data in the pharmaceutical industry. And Steve and I are going to propose a hypothesis today about why that may be the case. Both of us work across multiple industries and sectors, not just pharmaceutical, and we see while other sectors have data accuracy challenges, they tend to address them in a more pragmatic and head-on way rather than the pharmaceutical industry, which tends to ignore the problem. So we're going to talk about why we think that is the case, and try to propose some actions about what we need to do differently in our industry to prepare ourselves for the future, which will inevitably involve artificial intelligence and other non-human governance processes that we need to be aware of. And so I'm looking forward to getting to that part and talking about that later in the presentation. So if we move on to the first slide in the presentation, Steve, do you want to take us through a little bit of background in Oliver Wight?
Yeah, sure, Gary. So so Oliver Wight, many of you may be familiar with Oliver Wight, having worked with us in the past, but some of you may not. So last year we celebrated 50 years since Ollie started the Oliver Wight company. So that was a real milestone for us as an organization, having 50 years of success. And in the day, he was a thought leader really for business excellence. He started working through some of the original processes that were challenging people in the day, and we've continued to mature those processes and are thought of as thought leaders today as he was in his day. We work through with processes around product demand, supply chain, and integrated business planning, so both short-term, long-term planning, and how that links to business planning and strategy. And our success is really driving improvement for your business. It's about how we can help you to enable you to be successful in applying best practice across your business. We work across sectors, as I said earlier, we work across multiple sectors, from aerospace to pharma to food beverage to engineering. So whilst the application may be different in different sectors, the key processes and the key principles remain sound, and that applies very much within the healthcare sector as a whole. So as an organization, we remain committed to your success in driving business improvement, and in supporting that, one of our major focus is also on people and enabling the change management needed to be successful and to deliver sustainable processes for you. So 50 years and moving forward into kind of the new world, where we have, as Gary said, some new challenges and opportunities coming with AI and machine learning, and we'll take a look later at how we see those applying to data. Maybe just move on. Just move on to the next slide with the agenda. So if you look at what we want to cover today, as Gary said, in the healthcare sector, I'd say my experience is data is often perceived as important. People do recognise it is important, if not critical, but often that's seen as important because it is life-saving drugs and products and products that you are supplying to the world. So in that sense, there's no doubt that data is often seen as important. Yet, when we work with people in the healthcare sector, we often find that data is either badly or poorly managed. So it's not that you are making the wrong products. It's not that the quality of the products is compromised. It's not that you are not meeting the regulatory requirements. But often when you look at planning, the data is badly or poorly managed, with results that end up with extra work and often workarounds. So we'll focus on that today. We'll focus on driving improvements in your processes, what those improvements need to be, where to focus, and how to drive those improvements. And we're going to focus on some of the planning data. So the planning data really is the foundation to the business planning processes. And then finally, we'll take a look into the future and look at what's coming very rapidly towards us with AI and machine learning, and what that offers in the world of data management. So just move on to the next slide. Thanks, Gary. Over to you.
Thanks, Steve. The reason for a webinar is because we have multiple times gone through the same conversation with healthcare clients that starts out with the client saying, of course our data is accurate, we're in a regulated industry, we could not operate without accurate data. And then we move on to a phase where we ask them, well, are you measuring your data? And the conversation then goes down the line of, well, we're not measuring all of the data, but of course our regulatory data is accurate because that's what's filed with the governing bodies. It then goes on to the next chapter where we get them to start measuring planning data, and very quickly are confronted with horrified planning professionals that realize the data they're working with is not accurate. We then go down a journey of improving the accuracy of the planning data and delivering the benefits that result from that. So having gone through that journey many, many times with healthcare clients, we've identified that the real difference with healthcare clients is that they are driven by the need to have exceptionally accurate regulatory data. And that in many respects eclipses the need to have accurate planning data. That is not always the case in other industries. So if I just spend a little time talking about these three different types of data, and that will hopefully explain our hypothesis. Financial data, first of all, is data that exists in the system, is used to control operations. How well are we performing against the standards that we've created? Where we are deviating from standards? What are we doing about getting back towards the standard and eliminating the variances? It's heavily focused towards the cost of the materials or the unit operations, and materials that are of a low cost and unit operations that are of a low cost tend to get less focus. When we come to regulatory data, this is the data, as you know, that is filed with the regulatory bodies in the drug master files, or the and this data is really focused on the critical to quality attributes in the manufacturing process, and what tolerances are allowed around those critical to quality attributes, what internal ranges are set in order to ensure we never breach those attributes, and there's an intense amount of focus on investigating every single deviation to those internal variations to the quality attributes and deviations from the standard. We then come to the planning data, and at this point the audience that we're talking to are convinced that their data is accurate. They looked at their financial performance and the variances from standard are minimal. They've looked at their regulatory data and the recalls that would result from breaching regulatory limits are minimal, and so they are under the misconception that their data is accurate. When we start to talk about planning data, it's an entirely different story. We start to talk to organizations about your planning bill of materials and your planning routings, and your master data files and your item master files. How accurate are they? And when we start to measure them, we find that they are incredibly inaccurate. If I was to say to you that measuring the accuracy of a typical bill of materials initially comes in at between 15 and 20% accurate, you may find that horrifying, but that is the reality. And all of the expensive workarounds, firefighting, expediting that results from that inaccuracy is absolutely not planned for, and there's an adverse variance to the budget, so it remains hidden right now. So if we move on to the next slide, I've adjusted those three bubbles to show this is something that's unique to the healthcare industry. The necessary obsession and focus on the accuracy of regulatory data, the deviations that are investigated, the root causes that are identified, the corrective actions that are put in place to ensure that regulatory data is robust and accurate, are eclipsing the effort that should be happening in an equal measure towards ensuring planning data is accurate. So the hypothesis that Steve and I are putting forward in this webinar is that unique to the healthcare industry is the fact that the necessity of accurate healthcare regulatory data is eclipsing and subverting the accuracy of planning data. It's hiding the problem, if you like. Looking to the next slide, if I take an example of a bill of materials is a good example of a data set that needs to be accurate. And I'll show here the financial bill of materials, the regulatory bill of materials, and the planning bill of materials. And in the beginning, most organizations may think, well, these are the same things. They are not. The financial bill of materials will be a set of standards that exist in your system that will be heavily weighted towards the most expensive items on the bill of materials. They will be measured by way of a material usage variance. And if all of these variances, plus and minus, cancel each other out over the period of a month, the material usage variance comes out as 0 and the data is perceived to be accurate. If we then look at the regulatory bill of materials, this is a bill of materials that's been filed with the regulatory authorities, and by nature, it has been designed to offer the organization a broad operating window for each quality critical attribute. So what is the broadest range that we can validate to ensure that we're not constantly violating the ranges and deviating from the filed limits? So by nature, these limits are broad. We do create tighter internal controls. We do investigate thoroughly all deviations from those tighter internal controls. And by doing this, we ensure that the regulatory limits that have been set are very rarely, if ever, breached. And therefore, the regulatory bill of materials is considered accurate. We then move on to the planning bill of materials, and we see a different story here. The planning bill of materials receives little attention. They are highly inaccurate, and over the years, some hardworking and talented people in the organization have developed workarounds within their daily practices to ensure that these inaccuracies are overcome. This may be carrying extra inventory or always ordering more raw material. And these type of workarounds are costly. And also because we don't investigate variances to planning bill of materials, invisible to the organization. The accuracy of the planning bill of materials is usually not measured and not known. And when we do start to measure, horrifically, we find out that is entirely inadequate to the performance of a high-performing organization. So that's the hypothesis we're putting forward. We'd like to, if we move on to the next slide, ask you now to think about your planning data, not your financial data, not your regulatory data, but the data that's used for planning in your organization, your bills of materials, your recipes and routines that drive your schedules, and your item master, material master data. And generally, give us a gut feel for, in your organization, do you believe that your planning data is 95 to 100% accurate, which would be wonderful, or is it not quite there, 75 to 95%? That's answer B. If you believe it's 50 to 75%, give us an answer C. Less than 50%, give us an answer D. If you don't measure it and therefore you don't know the accuracy of your data, then return with an answer E. So we'll give you a minute now to answers, and we'll have a look at the results in 1 minute's time. Excellent. Okay, thank you for that response. There was an 83% return from all of the attendees, so it's good to see we have a good level of engagement. Interesting, isn't it, Steve? There's nobody on the entire webinar that's in the 95 to 100% category that we would consider Class A.
Yeah, that is interesting. And often when we ask this question in our workshops, people will say, I think it's 95 to 100. And of course, I think isn't good enough, because the real question is, do you measure it? And do you have measures that tell you how accurate it is? So it's quite interesting there that we've got a broad spectrum on the kind of middle to lower end.
Yeah, and I think the don't measure, don't know category is something we'll be able to help out with in the next section of the webinar, that is targeting and identifying what are the critical data sets that you should be measuring and how do you go about measuring them. So if we kick off with that section now, Steve, and then I'll carry on with what do we do about AI in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So if we just look at the kind of processes that we are trying to consider from a planning perspective. So if you look at the center of the, or to just the right screen, the master supply plan and the schedule, that really is, from a planner perspective, they're kind of starting point from a planning role. They're clearly looking for inputs from the demand and before that from the signal that's coming from the customer. So that's on the left-hand side is the independent demand and a demand plan, which has to really come from the commercial side of the organization of what they believe they are going to sell or supply into the market. And then to get from the demand plan to the master supply plan, we need to think about inventory and warehouse distribution. So we need to think about the inventory netting off against inventory to generate that master supply plan. But from that point, and from a planner perspective, it is the master supply plan that then drives the processes. So that's what we intend to make or intend to buy. And that depends on whether the product is something we make internally or whether it's something that we source externally. And when we move a little bit, well, we'll just have a look at the difference of the signals that generates. But the two processes that data really drive in our systems is the material requirements planning and the capacity requirements planning. So we just take a look at those separately. So material requirements planning, that is just the calculator in the system to look at the material requirements to support that supply plan going forward. And because it's a calculator, it needs data to drive it. So that the quality of that material requirements plan, or MRP, will only be as good as the data that feeds that calculation in the system. And that's why critically the data elements need to be managed. And if you just quickly look at the data elements for master material requirements planning, so clearly we need to know what the batch recipe is for the product we're going to make, or what components that's made up of, and that comes from our bill of material or batch recipe in the system that tells me when I'm going to make that product, that's what I need to make that product. And supporting that, we need some of the planning data around the items to tell us some of the parameters like lead time, order quantity, etc., unit of measure, etc., that help us to do that calculation. So all of those need to be managed within the system. And then on the right hand side, the other part of that equation is I need to know what inventory I've got on hand, and particularly in the healthcare sector, I need to know what inventory is actually available for me. So if I've got inventory on hold, or I've got inventory in QA, I need to get visibility of that and whether that's going to be available for me to use. So the status of inventory becomes critical in the healthcare sector, probably more than others. So using those inputs, I can generate my material plan. And surprisingly, we go into businesses, again, in many sectors, but this happens in the healthcare sector as well, where we talk to material planners and say, how are you using the system? And their answer usually is, I would love to use the system, I'd love to use MLP, but I can't. And if you ask the question, why can't you use MLP? Because fundamentally it works. The answer is, I don't trust the data. And that's where people come out of the system and they start doing workarounds to get visibility of what they need for the future. And that's just something that has to change in the business if we're going to get effective around our business processes, because those workarounds take time and effort. As Gary said, it leads to the firefighting and the extra work that's non-value add for people. So that's really the material side, and we'll take a little bit look in more detail in a second on that one. For capacity, so equally to support my master supply plan, I need to know what capacity and capability I need to support that plan. So in the same way in the system, we can use the capacity requirements planning, CRP, to generate a capacity plan that we can use to support our supply plan and schedule. So here the data is looking at the routing or routing master data, depending on which part of the world you come from. The pronunciation is slightly different. But we need to know that master data for the routing, because that tells us how we're going to make the product and what machines or labor or people we're going to need to make that product. Often that's done badly. Again, when we talk to businesses and we say, who manages your routing master data, the answer very often is finance. So whilst finance have a role to play, the actual routing really does belong to the operations team, because they make the product. So they have to own the parameters around routing, and that needs to roll up into the financial number, the financial plan. So there's a question there often around ownership for managing that data. And then work location master data around where we make the product and the equipment or the people. We need to understand what the parameters are around that. So how many hours do I need? What's the calendar for that work location? What's the efficiency of that work location, utilization, etc. And that drives all the calculations that go into the capacity requirements planning. But there is one other aspect that is critical when we're looking at capacity. And again, often done badly by many businesses because they are over optimistic of their capacity and capabilities. So they may have a supply plan that the system says, yes, you have enough capacity against your routing work location, but in practice, the demonstrated performance doesn't match that capacity. And that's where load factor comes in to give us a true picture of demonstrated capacity or demonstrated capability. And that load factor is based on recent history. It tells us the kind of efficiency and performance of the operations, the work centres, and really keeps us honest from a capacity planning perspective when we look at the master supply plan. So you can think of the material requirements plan, the capacity requirements plan of being able to validate the capability to meet that plan, because we can check, have we got the right materials, and will the materials be available at the right time? And we can check capacity to say, have we got the right capacity, and will that capacity be available at the right time to support that supply plan and schedule? So if we move on just to the next slide, and it just breaks it into a little bit more detail around where that master data really underpins the process. So you can see in the center, that's a lot of the process we've just talked around supply planning and the master plan, etc. But the process support that are the resource requirements planning on the left-hand side, and the material planning that comes really from the right-hand side. So again, if you look at the drivers in terms of data that get us to a point where we have good, solid processes that we can rely on, we need to think about what are the parameters that are going to drive that information, and where does that ownership of those parameters reside in the business. So for me, one of the key aspects of driving improvement in data accuracy is identifying, well, first of all, understanding the data sets and the definition of those data sets, but predominantly it's about establishing ownership, both from an accountability perspective of who owns the data and responsibility of who's going to manage and update that data. And often they are different, but they both are critical to maintaining the quality of that data. So left-hand side, we've called out a few of those key areas of resource profiles to drive the resource requirements planning. That's really driving some of the long-term planning and the assumptions we're making around our resources. When we get into the rough cut, then it's actually looking at our critical resources, and again, we're developing load profiles that tell us what the performance of those particular critical resource has been and will be in the future. And then when you get into detail planning, that does go down to the level of the routing file and the detail of how we're going to make the product, how long it takes to make the product, and where we're going to make the product. And then the work location file drives some of the underpinning data around the performance of those work centers, around the calendar availability, etc., to allow us to develop a good operating schedule. And that in turn then drives the shop floor schedule, which is a detailed schedule. On the right hand side, we've covered some of this already in the previous slide, but the key parameters driving material planning is bill of materials, which absolutely is fundamental to the quality of the plan. As Gary said, often it meets the regulatory requirements, it meets the financial requirements, but doesn't meet the planning requirements. And that's where we see that typical measure of between 10–15% when we start to measure bill of material in practice. Stock records, it's about making sure that we've got the right material in the right location, the right quantity, and the right status. So it's kind of a forward check of item quantity, status, and location within wherever we hold our inventory. And you just need to consider that from end to end where inventory is held in the business. And then the item master file is probably the biggest file, and we'll talk about it in a bit more detail in a second, but it's a file that then generates the planning parameters associated with that item. All of those then drive our order scheduling and supplier scheduling. So just move on to the next slide. I just want to talk around some of the important considerations for those data sets. So if you look at the complexity of what we're trying to manage, if we look at the item master file, that's probably the biggest set of data, arguably, that we're going to have, because if you look at an item master, it can have 60 to 100 fields against the item master, and that wouldn't be untypical in an ERP system. So we need to kind of break that down into what data is critical from a planning perspective and make sure we have a good understanding of those fields and which are likely to cause issues in the planning process if they are not managed or correct. So it's the understanding really that we need to get first, that looks at the fields and understands the impact of having that field error and what that would mean from a planning perspective. And it can be as simple as a unit of measure that is different from your ERP system to your supplier, which again would cause a problem. It can be as simple as a lead time that is measured incorrectly because it doesn't allow for QA incoming release in the business. So the value that's in the system is the wrong value to measure the total time for incoming lead time. If you look at bill of materials, that really is get an understanding of what's critical in the bill of materials. And I'd say all items are critical in the bill of materials, but some items you may choose to put a tolerance into those items. So if you've got items where it is an each and it's a fixed quantity or a known quantity, then there should be no discussion of whether that's right or wrong. That should be very clear. But there'll be some items, we give the example there, purified water, where that may be less critical and you may have a wider tolerance because it is liquid and you're typically going to be adding that in from a valve of some description. So you may choose to have a tolerance in the bill of material that says that I just allow for a degree of tolerance when I check the bill of material for that item. We do need to check that the bill of materials is both accurate against your master data, but also accurate against your usage. So this is where material variance has a part to play in validating the bill of material accuracy. Stock records we've talked about, it's really around where that inventory is held. So it's not just warehouse, it is inventory that is in the plant, and it does include work in progress. So typically we have to have processes to measure the accuracy of line side inventory as well as warehouse. And probably arguably the easier area to get control of is your warehouse. The manufacturing, because it tends to be more dynamic, is sometimes a harder area to get control of inventory. And for me, that probably comes down to the disciplines needed to manage the consumption of inventory as much as actually the inventory itself. The routings, we've discussed a little bit about routings, but again, we need to make sure that these are owned by the right people in the business, and that we have validated the routing or the routing for that particular process. So often the challenge here is making sure that they are complete, that we take into account all the different steps that need to be included, whilst making sure they're practical and not overcomplicated. And again, to validate these, we do a check to make sure that the time taken reflects the actuals that we are performing. So it's a check back to validate that we are measuring the variance for the routing as we go through the actual process itself, to revalidate that the routing is correct in the system. And then lastly there we have work locations. So this is really the data that doesn't change as much as the ones above. So this is really about making sure that we've got the right data associated with any work center or work location within the business. So it might be a machine, it might be an area, or it might be physically a space like a warehouse, to understand how that operation of that particular work center works. So what shifts do we run, how many hours per shift, how many days per week do we have? So you can see the level of detail required to support the planning processes, and I'd say devil is in the detail when you get into data management.
Thanks, Steve. And often, as you would say, when we're talking to a client about the accuracy of their data, and we're in the warehouse, and we're talking to a warehouse manager, for example, about the accuracy of the data in the warehouse, and they'll say, yes, of course it's accurate, and we'll say, how do you know? And they'll say, well, every time we do a pick, we check the remaining balance, and if it's wrong, we make an adjustment in the system. So therefore, it's continually correcting itself. And we ask, well, how many times are you making adjustments? And they say, oh, well, quite often. And so therefore, your data is not accurate. Do you understand why it's not accurate? And no, not really. And that's the way many of the conversations go. We'll speak to finance folks, for example, about how accurate is the data, and they say, well, from a value point of view, all of the variations cancel each other out, and the critical high value items are pretty accurate, so we're happy with that. And then we talk to the planning folks, and they'll say, well, every time I release a work order, I have to phone the warehouse to check whether the materials required for this work order are actually there, because I don't believe the numbers I see on my screen. And that is really outing the truth. The workarounds that the material planners and the production schedulers need to do to account for the inaccuracy in data are enormous. And are hidden by the perceived accuracy of the data from these other functions.
I think, Gary, that's why the measurement is so critical as a part of the process, to make sure you've got the measurements in place to understand the performance of data accuracy for the business. If we jump to the next slide, and just talk through some of the challenges of how do you measure the planning data. And it is one of my tests often in the warehouse is with the planners is one of the questions I ask is, if you're low on inventory and the inventory level is low in the system, do you trust the system, or do you go check or have somebody check? And if the answer is I have to go check, then that usually sends alarm bells of is the inventory really being managed around a high level of data accuracy? If the answer is I trust the system, then usually that suggests that they have a good process to manage and monitor the inventory accuracy. So if you look at the measurement, and it really is about making sure you establish the measures for all those data sets that Gary and I have talked through. So we need to be clear of, and this goes back to the accountability again, whose accountability for the quality of that data, because that's the person or the role that has to really maintain and ensure that that data has been measured and accurate. But in achieving that, we do need to go through and identify what fields are critical that need to be measured, which ones would we accept a tolerance in that measurement. And my default is generally probably the same with Gary. My default is you shouldn't have a tolerance unless you can justify the reason for that tolerance. But clearly you need tolerances for some measures. And then make sure you have a process to measure those routinely. And it is about making this routine. It's about people seeing part of their role is to routinely run this measure, check the accuracy against a sample population to make sure that they can report that level of accuracy. And if they do that routinely, it doesn't become a burden, it becomes part of their job, and actually driving that improvement becomes much, much easier. And it also becomes a trigger when something changes. So just keeping that measure as a routine part of the business process in making sure that we've got visibility of data accuracy. When it drops, and sometimes it will, when it does drop, you can catch it very quickly, do some root cause analysis behind why it's dropped, and then drive some improvement. So it really is about making this part of the culture of the organization, that it's seen as important and that the business has visibility of those measures for everyone to see, so that they become trusting in both the performance and the quality of the measures and the ability to use the system to its best advantage. Just a word as well on, we talked about data quality a lot around accuracy, but I do think there's two parts to this. So you do need to make sure that in your processes and in the way you measure, that you've got visibility of both the data accuracy, which is a very tangible thing to measure, but also data integrity. So often it's data integrity is the problem because people don't do transactions in a timely manner. So if you look at the example we talked about earlier with line-side stock, often the issue there is data integrity, in that the transaction hasn't happened at the right time because someone will get to it later. And because of that, then the planner can't see what's actually physically available or being used. And that's where they start to lose trust in the system as well. So it's both the accuracy and the integrity that we're trying to measure as we go forward. If we move on to the next slide, I think we've got a polling question for you here. So if you just think about things we've talked about and some of the challenges of making data important in your business, and this does need often a focus to make sure it's important, but there are some perceived barriers in getting there. So we just want to get your opinion on this poll of what you see as the biggest barrier in getting your data management program up and running. So is it the system? Is it the system configuration that can be a barrier? And often that can be understanding of the system and its usage. Is it the resources to do the measuring and to build some sustainability in our processes? Or is it leadership support? Do leaders see this as critical and important to the business? Or is it people in the business can't see the benefit? So that they don't see that there's any issue around data, and therefore why put the effort in the first place? Or lastly, are you already measuring, and do you have accurate data today? So we'd just like you to give your scores against the poll, against what you think is the biggest barrier to getting your data management program up and running today. And we'll just leave that running for 20-30 seconds whilst we get your scores in. Okay, that's good. Okay, so just looking at that, so number one was the resource to the measuring, and I think that's a valid challenge, because often that is part of the barrier around, do we have the ability and the structure to support the management of data, which goes back into sometimes the data governance model that you have, and how it's built into people's day-to-day jobs. So maybe that's a challenge there. System configuration, number two. And I guess that often comes up in that sometimes it's not easy, especially if you've got multiple systems that you're communicating between. And sometimes it is about understanding that system landscape and being able to configure that of where the master data sits and what's the slave master relationship across the data sets that you have. Leadership support is coming third there, after we already measure, and can't see the benefits. So there's a 10% on can't see the benefit, people not seeing the benefit of why this is important.
Yeah. There's a paradox there, isn't there, Steve, in that we don't have the resources to measure how accurate our data is, because those resources are too busy firefighting the consequences of inaccurate data. And so how do you get out of that conundrum? And so that we can say from our experience that genuinely when you are on top of your data and you have repeatability and reproducibility of your processes and consistency of outcome, all of the firefighting that goes into overcoming the deviations and the exceptions can be applied to improving the accuracy of the data rather than dealing with the consequences of the inaccuracy. So that is a paradox, and it does take a leap of faith, if you like, to believe that if we focus on improving the accuracy rather than dealing with the consequences, we will have the right outcome. And that leap of faith does require a significant, from the front, leadership support that highlights data accuracy as being critical to running the business. And that is not always the case in our experience.
Yeah, and I would say you're absolutely right. It's to get the resources initially. It does take extra effort to get back into control around the planning data. So if you're living with symptoms of poor planning data, there's no doubt it takes effort to get that resolved, and therefore it does take resource to both manage that and measure that and become important. But I think the other thing I'd say is you can, if you focus correctly, you can make some big steps forward very quickly with data. Around doing some root cause analysis, and you can start to make some strides forward very quickly. So the amount of effort that goes in pays back relatively quickly into the business.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so if we move on from that to now looking towards the future, we've been in this world of humans are required to use data to create plans. Humans are required to be accountable for the accuracy of that data, and humans are required to overcome scenarios where data is inaccurate. And that's the world we live in today. But more and more, when we talk to the software giants and the clients that are using these big systems, we are seeing the intervention of artificial intelligence in creating plans for the business going out into the future. And whereas this was the inevitable and it's been obvious for a while, what we're seeing more and more lately is that not only will this artificial intelligence, or if you call it machine learning or algorithms or neural networks or big data, whatever you want to call it, not only will they start to take over the activity of creating the plans, but they will start to take over the activity of managing the data. Artificial intelligence networks now are already capable of detecting inaccurate data and making assumptions and changes to that data on your behalf. So everything from warehouse management, material movement, material planning, operation scheduling will all be done to a greater and greater extent by machines or robots or algorithms. So our hypothesis here is that in a world where we are handing over more and more control to robots and machines and algorithms, and giving up the human interventions where we are overcoming the inaccuracies manually, we're moving into a world where those companies that have accurate enough data now will benefit very quickly from the intervention of artificial intelligence, and we'll see exponential improvements. Whereas those companies that have really poor data right now will not immediately see the benefits of the intervention of artificial intelligence and algorithms. So our coaching, our counsel right now, based on all of the clients that we see and all of what we see happening in the future, is get control of your master data now. And if we move on to the next slide, just to bring this to the last thoughts on this subject. So while in time artificial intelligence will learn to correct inaccurate data, we need to make sure that we enter this battle with good enough data so that learning curve can be exponential. Organizations that enter this new world with good data will see these benefits quickly. And those will be few and far between. Organizations that enter the world with poor data will not see these benefits at all. The whole way that artificial intelligence will apply itself to improving data accuracy will rely on a foundation of good enough data that can reveal patterns and trends within the data so that the AI can detect anomalies and make improvements. If your data is down at 10 to 15% accurate, there won't be patterns and trends. There will just be chaos as it is today, and you won't see benefits. So prepare yourself for the future now by robustly tackling the accuracy of your master data. So that's the end of what we wanted to talk about today. I wanted to open it up in the few minutes that we have remaining for your questions. So be happy to, I'm looking at the questions box now to see, type it in. Steve and I will pick the most popular questions that are coming through and try to answer them in the next 3 or 4 minutes. So there's a question about how long does it take to improve the accuracy of data from once you start tackling the problem, and that's it's an interesting question, isn't it, Steve? The majority of the time is wasted on denial that there is a problem until we get to a point where we've confronted the problem, we're measuring it, and we could easily, with the client, burn 6 months away trying to convince them that there's a problem before they actually see that it exists. And so avoid that. Don't go down the denial route. Once you've confronted the problem, it could be a matter of 3 to 4 months measuring and driving improvements before you start to get to the levels of control that we need.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think from the point where you start to get the measures and do some good, thorough root cause analysis, you can make big inroads very quickly in driving the improvement of the quality of that data. So it is months rather than or weeks and months rather than a long period once you start to get on top of the root cause analysis.
Right, once you've got through the denial phase.
Yeah.
So there's another question about how do we determine what data is critical, and that really goes back to what we were saying right at the outset of this presentation. If there's a data set that has a data object that is going to influence the organization, if it's wrong, then that's a critical data object. If it's a data object that is not going to significantly influence the organization, we'd say that was less critical. But you do need to go through that exercise of determining what is critical and what is not, and then measure the critical. So just to bring this to a close in the remaining minute or two, there are multiple other sources that you can go to. If you've liked this webinar and you want to find out more, on the Oliver Wight website, you'll see that we've written books, we have white papers, and we have public courses that you can attend. One of the public courses that may be interesting to this group would be a healthcare-focused webinar, a healthcare-focused workshop that we're doing in Dublin on the 9th and 10th of September. And for all attendees of this webinar, we'll be offering a 10% discount. So go online, have a look, register, and look forward to seeing you at that webinar, at that workshop. Thank you very much.
And with the added bonus that's in Dublin, where you can savour the Guinness.
Indeed, and hopefully we're allowed to travel there by then.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining today. Thank you.